So after this wonderful and informative introduction, I would like now to introduce our next guest, Eva Díaz. But before, I would like to inform you that our guest, or as you could see it still on the old program, Christa Brüstle, won't hold her talk. So we won't have this talk, but therefore a little bit more time for Eva Díaz. The Black Mountain teachers and artists became famous for their interdisciplinary work and vision in new forms of creating and reflecting art and art practice, as we heard yesterday and this morning. For the past years, researchers revisited the Black Mountain College to reevaluate the value for today's art and research, as Eva Díaz does in her intensively scholarly work and today's talk. The Black Mountain College Experiment Revisited. Eva Díaz is assistant professor in the History of Art and Design Department at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. Her books, as the latest, The Experimenters, Change and Design at Black Mountain College, released 2015 by University of Chicago Press, explores the work and outwork of Black Mountain College by offering a new angle on its major figures and a productive link to today's art world. Eva Díaz's written reflections on art and design appear in various magazines and well-known journals such as the Art Bulletin, Art Journal, Art in America, Cabinet, The Exhibitionist, Freie, Grey Room, October, etc. She is also a regular contributor to Art Forum. Awarded with a Creative Capital Warhol Foundation Art Writers Grant, Eva Díaz took up her research for her book about Buckminster Fuller's work titled The Fuller Effect, The Critique of Total Design in Post-War Art. Her talk today will, next to reflections on the concepts of Black Mountain College, share parts of a new research project, which we are very much looking forward to. So please welcome Eva Díaz.
Yeah, sure. Fine. First of all, I want to thank you all for inviting me, particularly for Annette and her wonderful introduction. And I'm not going to cover too much of the same ground, so I'll give a kind of whirlwind tour of my research over the last 10 or so years on Black Mountain College that resulted in the book The Experimenters that just came out this year. But I do want to continue some of these ideas, I guess, in the revisitation part of my talk, to think about the legacies of Black Mountain College today, and in particular to sort of tease out one thread extending from the work Buckminster Fuller did at Black Mountain College into contemporary art practices today. So because we have extra time, since the next speaker isn't here, I do want to leave some an ability for us to discuss and talk in that period. So essentially, I'm going to give you two talks, like the little Black Mountain College, sort of experimentation, the core ideas, and the sort of what we can think of in a way as the Black Mountain College idea of the experiment and testing, and then to kind of move on to this Buckminster Fuller work I'm doing, and then open up for discussion after that. So I just want to mention, and we've seen, some versions of these images, and many of them, are in the very nice show here. And I just want to kind of think, and it's interesting to be here in Berlin having this discussion about Black Mountain College, and to really think about how neglected, I guess, the topic has been in the United States. That's going to be remedied this fall. There's a show opening at ICA Boston next month that the curator Helen Molesworth has put together. But really that represents, at least as long as I've been working on this topic, which is about 15 years off and on, there really hasn't been much of a reception of the college in terms of, thinking about those ideas, and that has happened much more in Europe in terms of exhibitions the Reina Sofia in 2003 that Vincent Katz did, and also at the Arnolfini in Bristol, England 10 years ago, and then of course this show now. So just to kind of think about why that, why that has been happening in Europe, and I think it really goes back to some of the key sort of cross-pollinations of Black Mountain College ideas that were already sort of happening transatlantic wise in the 19-teens. I mean, the foundation of the Bauhaus was in certain ways derived from John Dewey's ideas of learning by doing, and the kind of reading of some of the faculty members of the translations of Dewey's work did sort of percolate out into a sense of the Bauhaus, as a place that would explore certain kind of procedures of making as opposed to more rote, repetition in terms of the pedagogy of art practice that was the sort of pre-existing model in Germany. And then that goes back, of course, to the United States through the emigre teaching of the Alberses and others that were at Black Mountain. So there's just already a kind of Atlantic communication going on around ideas of art practice, and now we're sort of back here to Germany with what has been largely considered a sort of American model of Black Mountain College, but of course we know that comes largely out of the Bauhaus teaching. So this is the first campus of Black Mountain College, Lee Hall, which just to kind of set the stage, I mean, I don't know how many of you have been to Western North Carolina, but actually my involvement in this project comes through a personal connection to the place, because as a child, I always spent my summers in the town of Black Mountain. And my grandmother retired to Black Mountain, and her mother retired to Black Mountain. So I never knew about Black Mountain College as a kid. I went to summer camp at a place not unlike this, in a nearby town called Montreat, which is actually the summer presbytery for Billy Graham's mission. So to think about this area is not really a hub of avant-garde culture, but actually the center of the Bible Belt in the American South. So, and my grandmother was, a child and teenager when Black Mountain College was in operation, and has all kinds of Native informant stories about the Black Mountain College folks, including her being scandalized that Black Mountain College people wore sandals, which was not good in the 1940s in this area. So, to kind of think about another kind of repression or sort of forgetting, which is that, this place disappeared really in 1957. It was bought by, and the current property owners are still Camp Rockmont for boys, which is a Christian summer camp, took over the Lake Eden campus. So, there really, it's really been the job of, of scholars, and also, of course, the interest among artists is huge to recover this place, because it really isn't a place, it hasn't been, a place, in the kind of sense of the word that you could participate in since its closure in 1957. So, this is a photograph I used in an article on Albers that sort of folded into my book about 10 years ago, and I was really pleased to see it beginning the show here, because to me it's such an enigmatic picture. I mean, it's just the terror in Joseph Albers' eyes, or maybe just sort of bewilderment. To end up in this rural Appalachian place, and I think this is part of the kind of mythos and mystery of Black Mountain, is that it is very far away from anywhere that is like the center of anything. I mean, if you think about this place, I mean, the isolation, sorry, this image is kind of bled out with the light, but I mean, this, even to get today to the campus, the Camp Rockmont, camp is, it's really off the beaten track. And the stories, I mean, even on my family's side, my mother discusses, has told me, like, it was crazy to go down there in the 50s, because you were going south of the Mason-Dixon line, which means once you cross the Mason-Dixon line, they changed the trains and the black people got in the back, and it was just like a lot of these visitors coming from the north, it was their first experience with Jim Crow segregation, and also just the very unique culture of the Appalachian Mountains, which is, it is very rural and very remote, and it's the kind of center of a lot of different kind of mountain culture. I was just in Black Mountain last month, actually for a banjo camp. So just to kind of like tell you what that place, the region is still very much like old time, culture and such. And I think it was an interesting cross-pollination in that sense, is that people would come to the college and treat it as a retreat, from some of the pressures of New York or wherever they were coming from. And I think the isolation is part of, or I guess you can sort of think of it as one root of why so many interesting collaborations happen there. I don't know if it could happen again in the era of the cell phone, although when you go to the region, because it's so mountainous, it's really hard to get good reception. So you might have a mini Black Mountain College, possibility, because you wouldn't be as connected to the outside world. So when in 1933, by this kind of sad historical coincidence of the Bauhaus closing, and through the help of Philip Johnson at the MoMA, Joseph and Annie Albers get this position at Black Mountain College, which has just been founded that very summer, due to this faculty governance dispute at Rollins College in Florida. So, bringing with them a very, this very particular model of experimentation that they had been developing at the Bauhaus. And I'm going to just focus on Joseph Albers, and I think very interesting things should and could be said about Annie Albers' version of experimentation and the way that she related and sort of distinguished art experimentation from craft experimentation, thinking about in craft how the apparatus, let's say, of the loom can overdetermine how much free experimentation, as she called it, you could have, but that there were still great potentials for thinking about an experimental process in craft. But to kind of set that aside as a kind of separate argument, to concentrate on what Joseph Albers was doing. And what he brought was the battery of courses that he'd been developing as the introductory course at the Bauhaus, which was basically three main courses, the provinces of form, as he defined it, which was color, design, and drawing. You can see here a class at Black Mountain College, and this real sort of modesty, and I think what I've always loved about Joseph Albers is this, he once said the highest virtues of an artist are honesty and modesty, and you just don't hear that a lot today, or ever. But this, just this kind of like everyone as a student idea, I think that was very important to him, is that this process of form, and as Annette had quoted him, saying it's this kind of unceasing possibility of experimentation and form. And I think what's very fascinating about Albers' model is this sense that there are no masterpieces. There's only this idea of testing endlessly the possibilities of form. And just to kind of think how that plays out in his own work, and how that reflects or sort of is sort of self-reflexive with the pedagogy, just to consider a work like this, which is an etching called Variance from 1940, and to think about what is going on in such a work. I mean, when I first began the Black Mountain College project as something that I was going to work on as a book, I felt this, like Albers was kind of an impediment. All of this sort of reputation of him as being, okay, so Prussian, so German, so doctrinaire, and this is the kind of lore of the college, or the sort of aftermath of thinking about this to think of it as a battery of three courses that you had to sort of think about the fundaments of form, and many students at Black Mountain and at Yale chafed against that sense of a rigidity, whereas even the ones who did chafe against it, let's say Robert Rauschenberg, later reflected how important it was to think about these essential properties as form, not as being basic or rudimentary, but really as fundaments. You can't understand all of this stuff. Like, everything has form in the world. It's made. And if you don't understand its properties in terms of its, the appearance of it and its material constitution, which are the emphasis that Albers gave to how, this sort of study of form would unfold, if you don't understand form, there's no way that you can creatively re-articulate it as an artist. And as an art historian or an art spectator, if you don't understand it, there's no way that you can really receive form, that you can understand what artists are doing. So this very core value of thinking about form as the everything of the world, the universal condition of any you know, our sort of human condition, right, is that there's stuff and that its history will just reproduce itself unless we're self-conscious about how it looks and how it's made. So to kind of think about, you know, at least this encounter, I think that many people, I'm not the only one to kind of feel with Albers' work, it's so simple, right? It seems that initially, like we're talking about geometric abstraction, this, you know, these fundaments of form, how much can you get out of a square? How much can you get out of Albers' monumental project of repetition, right? Like the homage to the square is probably the most strange and compulsive project of the 20th century, let's say. But in that, where is, you know, what's going on with that? I mean, you know, the terms that Albers used to describe his work and his pedagogy were dynamism, and how do we find that in the work? I mean, what's going on, you know? And to think about a work like this as an example is to say, okay, we initially sort of go, okay, we know what we're seeing here. It's like 6 forms, and it seems sort of repetitious. And then I think and many of you who are art students probably have had a sort of Bauhaus-derived training in which this is all old, you know, news to you. But I think even for someone like me trained as an art historian, not as an artist, Albers, a work like this provides a kind of opening to understanding how to think about, again, the appearance and material constitution of form. And so here we have these 6 form groups, and then as you can concentrate on them, look at them more carefully, you begin to see that they're not actually the same, right? I mean, there's subtle differences going on between these in terms of the shading of various elements of the form group, even the way that these ellipses are formed, some are different than others, and then this last form group is actually transposed. So I think, you know, the sense that we know what we're seeing is kind of and with what Albers called this kind of, he phrased his own practice as perceptual art. And I think for him that was an interesting circuit of how the retinal, what he called retinal projection, like the sense that our eye is apperceiving the world all the time. I mean, we just see too much, right? Like our eyes are like taking it all in, but we don't actually know what we're seeing a lot. We make assumptions, and there's a kind of crust of habit about us making judgments about what we see, and we don't actually sort of break out of that habit very frequently to understand that perception is actually a sort of combination of the retinal and the cognitive. And that's, I guess, where he put perception as this mediating zone between this immediacy of the eye, the retinal, like reception of the world, and what we think about what we see, which would be perception, and then thinking itself as cognition, right? So this ability of a work to kind of pry open habit, and just even in allowing yourself to kind of think about this variation here, and to sort of second guess your assumption of like, I know what I'm seeing, and just to kind of spend a little time with this as an artwork, as a kind of set of you know, previously considered intentions on the part of an artist to allow you to attend to a particular moment here of form. This dry point etching allows you to kind of unfold the subtlety of perception, which was really the experimental model of the Bauhaus. Very interested in this zone of perception. How do we see the world? How can we change the way we see the world? And how does that allow us to kind of, in a way, revolutionize all of this old stuff? Because if we just accept it again, if we let tradition kind of clutter our lives, then we're not able to kind of think afresh or think anew about the possibility of creativity as new form. So this, you know, plays out. Sorry, these are very. I wonder if we could. Is it possible to get that one down a little bit, just to the blind, because it's sort of hard to see with Albers. It's like color. I could show you what I'm seeing. It's really bright, but this is just to show you on the left-hand side. This is a series that Albers began at Black Mountain College called Variance, which is the same name as this work, but a very different kind of practice. And this work came out of his travels in Mexico, and many of this Variance series relates to the forms of architecture, the adobe houses that he and Annie were seeing in Mexico. So he often called these like the windows and the frames, and what you're seeing here are these kind of 2 central windows. So even though this is geometric abstraction and it's sort of not like, you know, kind of naturalistic, it still does derive from the architecture of in his travels, and just to kind of underscore this idea of thinking what you see. This is a study from Interaction of Color, his training manual from 1961. That really kind of was the culmination of many, many years of his teaching these color courses at the Bauhaus, at Black Mountain, and at Yale. And it's so hard with a projection to kind of get some of these effects, because even in the Interaction of Color manual, all of the images are silk-screened, because Albers didn't want there to be mixing of colors. And in fact, in his paintings, he never mixed pigments, except for the color pink, which was not commercially available. And so each of his works is kind of using paint as a ready-made. And just maybe to jump ahead for a second, and then I'll take your question. On the back of every Joseph Albers painting, there's what I call these recipes, a kind of proto-conceptualist instructions about every single thing he did to get that work to look, to be done. So all of the paints he would list, and then the varnish and the actual scale, and sometimes the mathematics of how he created these forms. And you can see here, this is just some playing around at the Albers Foundation in Connecticut with some of these studies that he did. These are templates that he would make and then put various different backdrops and sort of test, this weighing, I guess, of what is the most dynamic composition. And I think just to return to this notion of dynamism is important, because he didn't want the work to be predictable in spite of its seemingly strict geometry. He wanted there to be some amount of ambiguity, and with this image it's quite hard to see because it's a little it's quite washed out, but this sense of, if I walk away, you won't be able to hear me. But there's this possibility to think like, well, how are these forms actually working in space? Is this a 2D thing that we're looking at, a 3D thing? Where's the point of transparency? Like, what layers are on top of one another? And I think when you break down an Albers, particularly his print work, but it's happening a lot in his paintings, is just this sense of projection and recession, and the kind of inability of the eye to distinguish, like, what's the bottom layer, what's the top, and this kind of, it's a tradition, I suppose you could say, even by the time Albers is doing this, to think of geometric abstraction as sort of playing with, this sense of dimensionality from Malevich, Mondrian into an Albers practice. The sense, is this work an object? And how do we underscore the object condition of it by thinking about layers, and how do we think of it as an elusive space, and literally like sort of working painting as illusion. So those two terms are also very important in Albers' work. But to just think about what's going on in this study from Interaction of Colors, these are actually the same color, this sort of grayish brown center color, but according to the neighbors, the blue or the yellow, it can seem to be darker or lighter. And this kinds of sense that, as Albers said, color is the most relative medium in art, meaning that it's always affected by mnemonic conditions. I mean, your memory of Coca-Cola red is not the same thing as producing the color Coca-Cola red, so everyone is going to come up with a different Coca-Cola red if asked to do so, or that, there's just this sort of possibility of thinking that, it's influenced by its neighbors, each color, so that there's no actual truth to what we see in the world. And that ability to kind of unhinge, truth value from creation, it was really important to Albers, because it's like we often, again, making judgments, like, oh, that's a black coat. But you think, well, actually, in a certain light, it's a little bit purple. In another light, it might look more green. And so why would we make this assumption, especially as artists or as art spectators? Why don't we actually inhabit this subtlety of perception more richly and allow ourselves to be in this kind of ambiguous zone of creation, right? Of like saying, well, that's a possibility to imagine that there's a lot of other ways to see the world and think about it. But you had a question before I zoom along. I know. Yeah, so we're going to have this. Sorry, this is like super bled out. There's actually 3 different pink, red colors in there. Take my word for it. So I'm just going to kind of zoom along. This is like my book in 20 minutes. But this is a photograph of John Cage when he first arrived at Black Mountain College. And so just to kind of hold this idea of Albers' vision of experimentation sort of in suspension while we move on to a very contradictory idea of experimentation. And just to kind of back up, there are many different practices happening at Black Mountain College in its relatively brief existence. And I think maybe one of the reasons why there hasn't been that much work done, let's say in the United States on Black Mountain, is it can feel like a very overwhelming topic. There's a lot of different people that went there, many, many interesting issues to consider in terms of community, collaboration, interdisciplinarity, the racial politics, the kinds of work that came out of it, the pedagogical models. And so, even within my argument, which is to think, like, what would be the kind of key Black Mountain College idea in terms of pedagogy and form? And for me, it was really this sense of experimentation, as self-contradictory as it is, because you have the Albers version of experiments, which is this kind of careful testing of variation in the interest of changing habits of perception. And then along comes John Cage in 1948 and essentially explodes that notion of experimentation and says, no, an experiment is any situation that an outcome is unknown. So none of this kind of careful, assessing and weighing of variables, but to really imagine experimentation as creating indeterminacy, which seems so self-contradictory. But I think what many of the figures at Black Mountain College that shared a rhetoric of experimentation, saw was that their practice was not in any way spontaneous or expressionistic. They weren't interested in the self and the translation of the complicated self into, like, let's say, the intractable medium of paint, like you could stereotype de Kooning or Franz Klein doing, but there was instead this sense of a sort of transformation that it's happening. And you can think of an experiment as transformational in the sense that what you're trying to do is actually change society in a way, but in particular to sort of change the spectator's ability to kind of understand their relationship to the artwork and the world and how spectatorial, participation might mediate this transformation. So just to unpack that in terms of John Cage's career, this idea of indeterminacy was something he was developing in the several times he came to Black Mountain, beginning in 1948. And he comes in 1948 with a suitcase full of scores by the composer Erik Satie, who was associated with Dadaism and died in 1923. And he included in this 18 scores, Satie's only play, which was Ruse of Medusa. And so at Black Mountain College, Cage stages a production of Ruse of Medusa, which is essentially a kind of proto-Marx Brothers slapstick. And very unlike the kind of German stuff going on at the college. And in fact, Cage infuriated many of the German faculty by prefacing one of his Satie performances with a speech denouncing Beethoven's harmonic tradition. That didn't go over well. And so there was this counter model that Cage was beginning to institute in terms of Satie's work as a composer, which emphasized duration as opposed to harmony. And Cage had actually studied with Schoenberg in Los Angeles and had some conflicts around the issue of harmony as early as the early 1930s, late 1920s. But so what the sense of duration is in musical, if you think of musical theory, duration is the only element that's unspecific as to pitch and tone. And what you can do with duration is really, in a way, democratize musical language because everybody can read a clock. And I think if any of you have seen a Cage performance, I mean, it's almost always like the clock is the most dominant element of what is happening. Everybody is sort of working according to the clock in time segments. And often these time segments were determined by chance. But what he's doing as he works through Satie's emphasis on duration, and I think this performance not only was well loved because people like Buckminster Fuller and Elaine de Kooning and Merce Cunningham performed in it, but also had an interesting quality of Satie's work to combine incommensurate elements. So what's happening in Ruse of Medusa is that you have this kind of slapsticky plot of the Baron Medusa and his daughter Frisette and her marriage and people falling down and silliness. And then there's these unrelated musical numbers that the mechanical monkey, played by Merce Cunningham in this performance, sort of dances, and there's a lot of sort of strange direction to the pianist about what's going on, and it's quite unrelated to the play. So the sense that there you can have these things combined that don't make any sense, essentially, and that becomes really important as Cage continues to mine French avant-garde traditions at Black Mountain College, and by the time he comes back to Black Mountain in 1952, he's really interested in Antonin Artaud's theater of cruelty model, in which for Artaud, the sense of what a theatrical event does is to kind of blow your mind, like to really assault the spectators with so much sensory overload that there would be this revolution, essentially, like the Surrealist Revolution would happen in theater, because you would realize that there's no longer a differentiation between you and performance, and you would go out into the street and have a sort of theater like all the time, because this has been dissolved, essentially, these differences of the inside and outside. Now that wasn't exactly what Cage took from Artaud, but he did really emphasize in some of the performances he did, beginning with what's been called the first happening in 1952 at Black Mountain College, to think about this idea of simultaneous events taken from Satie and this kind of sensory overload taken from Artaud to stage the happening with the pianist David Tudor. And this is just, the Black Mountain College is like the most photographed place ever. Like, there's just pictures all of everything except for this event. So the sort of mystery of the happening has much to do with this, elusive quality that, there was no photography. So this is a reconstruction of the space of the dining hall, in which you can already see this sense of interpenetration. The audience is sort of broken into these clusters that the performance moved between them. And this is M.C. Richards' retrospective reconstruction of how some of those other events, some moving through the audience space and some around it, happened. And this is the only known kind of artifact of the happening. This is something I found in the Cunningham papers about 10 years ago, and it's one of the scripts. And each of these time segments was determined by chance. And so this is something that is really the kind of switch that's happening for Cage. He'd already been working with chance as early as 1950, 51 with Music for Changes. And what he meant by this, or what he was doing with chance, is basically creating a randomization tool. So using the I Ching, not as the Chinese book of changes, not as a divination tool, but one that allowed you to randomize the outcome, or using a flip of a coin to say, you would basically ask questions like, how long should this segment be? And then use the yarrow sticks or the flipping of the coin to create a time segment. First number comes up 2, second number comes up 8. And this is how you get, some of these durations, or maybe what would the next thing be, A or B, and then flip a coin and it says B. So you're kind of creating, like plotting out. You're sort of not allowing chance to ask the questions, but sort of answer them in terms of the time segments. But as he's at Black Mountain and in New York in the early 1950s, in this kind of crucial 1952 period where the first happening is staged, and also 4 minutes and 33 seconds is performed just a few weeks after the first happening in Woodstock in 1952, a score generated by chance, is to think, okay, so you have a chance-determined score. But the problem with that is it's always the same afterwards. Like Music for Changes, the 1951 score by Cage, it's always the same. But how, and what Cage was interested in is creating something less determinate, using chance to then open up further possibilities of chanciness and to create an indeterminate score. So what's happening here, and this happening, and why it's kind of considered such a crucial piece of his work, and the kind of linkage to 4 minutes and 33 seconds, the score that has no intentional sound on the part of the performer, is that there's a kind of indeterminate possibility in the end. You just don't know what's going to happen. So 4 minutes and 33 seconds, there's 3 movements in which, again, the performer makes no intentional sound, but there's always the ambient sound that changes. His interest in silence was not because he believed there was such a thing as silence, but there was something about alerting you to how there wasn't that was so important. So if we had 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence here, there would not be silence. There'd be fidgets, ambulances going by, the sound of the humming of the HVAC system or whatever. So there's this possibility to think environment as already rich with sound. And just as a kind of brief digression, many of you probably already have heard this anecdote, but his kind of sense of this came out of his Cage being in what's called an anechoic chamber, which is like a place where it's completely soundproof. And so at Harvard in 1951, he went to an anechoic chamber, and then he left and asked the engineer, well, I still heard two sounds. Is there a problem with this room? And the engineer said, well, was one high and one low? And Cage says, yes. And the engineer says, well, the high one is your nervous system, and the low one is your heart, your blood pumping. So that's where he had this epiphany, like there is no such thing as silence, because your body, you're embodied already in like a motion machine, it's an emotion, an organism that, you know, is sort of rich with this potential to think, okay, there is no, you know, kind of intentional control as a composer that you can exert because you're already kind of over-determined by your organism and the sounds it makes. So here's the last part of the whirlwind tour, and to kind of think about a third model of experimentation at Black Mountain, which was that brought by Buckminster Fuller, who also came to the college for the first time in 1948. And I think, you know, probably many of you know this history already, but just to think about how unknown some of these people were when they first came to Black Mountain. When Cage arrived in 1948, it was for his first ever teaching commission for composition. He'd always been billed as Merce Cunningham's piano accompanist, so he was delighted to sort of be taken seriously as a composer for the first time. And the same thing with Buckminster Fuller. He'd never taught before. He came to Black Mountain in 1948, although he began teaching at Institute of Design in Chicago a little after this in the fall and came back in 1949 a little bit more seasoned as a teacher. But, you know, Joseph Albers was extending most of these invitations to faculty and just, you know, coming up with names based on recommendations or based on, you know, looking at art magazines is how he hired de Kooning because he saw a review of de Kooning's first show that didn't sell anything. So in spite of the differences between these figures, and so, you know, we're kind of thinking about experimentation as this already sort of complicated set of concerns around chance and design and, you know, indeterminacy and intention. And, you know, I'm not really taking up the expressionist, you know, history at Black Mountain College, which would be people like de Kooning or Franz Klein who were there. But you know, Albers was inviting them all, and he wanted the students to have a very rich experience, whether it's de Kooning, you know, doing a completely different kind of painting practice, based, I guess, more on this idea of translation of self with paint, and inviting people like Cage and Fuller, who had visions of experimentation that were very different from his own. Now, someone like de Kooning ends up kind of undermining the Black Mountain College ethos by telling all the students to drop out and move to New York and get a studio. So some of these counter models were not necessarily pedagogical ones, but or kind of explicitly, you know, not about teaching or learning. So when Buckminster Fuller comes in 48, he brings a vision of experimentation or kind of model of experimental practice that is very different, you know, again, from Cage's sense of the chance process, as these outcomes unknown in the interest of unleashing indeterminacy, or this Albers model of this careful testing of variation. And what Fuller is doing is essentially trying to prove that everything will be known. Like he's got this teleology that he's working toward, like everything is going to be understood. And the point is to just keep failing until we figure it all out. And so this holistic sense that, you know, science, and for him science was always a hybrid with art, because traditional science and traditional architecture to him were completely defunct as possibilities to like create a new world. They were too specialized, and what art could provide was this model of a kind of comprehensive design, is what he phrased it. And so there's just an interesting nexus here around science and art and what we can consider experimentation, I think a little bit more traditionally conceived, which is experiments sort of test truth toward knowledge. And then that's pretty much in line with what Fuller was thinking. But he allowed this kind of open-endedness in the experiment in the sense that if you're such a visionary, like he was, then eventually, you keep testing and testing and truth will be found, but in that process, there's going to be a lot of failure. And that was a really liberating idea for students in particular, and is, I think, one of the reasons why Fuller becomes so important through the late 50s and 60s and 70s, and why basically he becomes like one of the counterculture gurus of the 60s, 70s period, is the sense that you have, as a student, a tremendous responsibility to change the world, and these experiments that you undertake may not succeed, but as long as you have a kind of altruism and a sort of generosity, I suppose, of thinking that you have the ability in this world, due to the kind of gains of technology, to feed, house, and clothe everyone, that you continue to fail until you stop failing, and that will be this kind of total perfect technocratic utilitarianism, which is a sort of frightening prospect, but I think for many, the liberatory element of this sort of ability to kind of jump into the experiment and just go right ahead and failure be damned. And I think this is where, even in his first kind of event, if you think of Fuller as a performance artist, perhaps more than a inventor or architect, it might kind of unpack what his charisma was. But this impresario bringing to Black Mountain College his three-wheeled Dymaxion home full of these energetic geometry models, and his ebullient personality, went a long way to kind of creating the sense that he had the answers. He was anticipating the kind of problems of the future, this anticipatory design science, as he phrased it, that would mean these comprehensive designers testing total knowledge in the interest of solving the world's problems. So he brings this idea for creating, he wasn't the inventor of the geodesic dome, but to kind of create a tension system of a geodesic dome construction, which you can see here failed and was good-naturedly termed the supine dome. It's Elaine de Kooning picking up the pieces. And so, for Fuller, he claims he knew that this would fail, but the point is to do it anyway, which is architecture. It's such a persuasive way of thinking, a kind of ad hoc architecture. It's like, just go there and try it, and it's going to fail. He felt like what you do with buildings is just keep building them up until they stop falling down. And that you can just treat the building materials like confetti, it just like sort of comes down around you. And that, has a kind of sub-emphasis of his in thinking about how much buildings weigh, because for the most part, because, he came from a Navy background and had worked on an aircraft carrier in 1917 during the First World War, and felt like this idea of buoyancy, both for ships and for air travel, was totally overlooked in the overbuilt constructions on land. And if you can think about lightning architecture, it could therefore be nomadic and then be responsive to the new conditions of 20th century culture, which is, why don't you just take your house with you? This kind of nomadism also became really important in how he was received in the 60s in terms of commune building and different kind of avenues coming out of the Whole Earth catalog in the 1960s. So this, he comes back to Black Mountain in 1949, the following year, after being offered the rectorship of the college, declines it, but returns with a smaller 14-foot aluminum lattice construction dome that he'd actually previously, just 2 weeks before, erected at the lawn of the Pentagon. It was kind of interesting convergence, always very quixotic in Fuller's career, is like, who's the patron for this stuff? It's like the U.S. military and college students. So this become, and I think it's sort of an intractable problem of Fuller, is that his sense that this anticipatory design science would be effective through mass production, would be the best use of these resources, was never put into practice. None of his there wasn't a single invention that was mass-produced, and that was always would undermine his sense of the cost-effectiveness and necessity of this invention to be put into place But again, this kind of patronage coming from these two avenues, it's like sort of interesting nexus of the problem of the post-war military industrial educational complex. And so here at Black Mountain, he's testing the plastic insulating skin here. And I liked this image so much, I put it on my book. So there's, this is to just kind of conclude, there's many ways that Black Mountain College has been influential. And my work, I've been kind of tracing some of these through these models of experimentation that these three figures, the kind of afterlives of this. This is just a project that I wrote about recently that was in the Heine Onstad catalog for Joseph Albers' show, and a project by Jill Majid, who's a performance artist that took those recipes on the back of every Albers work. She had went to the Albers Foundation and did a residency, and then actually taught herself how to paint based on Albers' instructions, and essentially became an Albers copyist. But I think that's really the potential for, I became a better art historian sort of learning through Albers, like, how to dehabituate, like your scene, right? Because if you're not a good artist, I never studied art, but like it can be overwhelming. Like, what is rendering? Like, how do I translate 3 dimensions into 2? What is that? And so what Albers would do with these techniques, like, okay, let's do mirror writing, like write something backwards, use your non-dominant hand for drawing, draw something upside down, and in those those practices, you would allow yourself to defamiliarize that apperceptive reality that just feels so immediate and like overwhelming, and to create these kind of kernels of production, of which Homage to the Square, I think, is an interesting project of repetition to really simplify out to these concentric, squares to kind of think about, each one motivating the next experiment. Again, there's no masterpieces, it's this unceasing testing of the material constitution, appearance of form. Each one motivates the next. So, okay, maybe these particular yellows, that looks like one yellow to you, but there's actually 3 different yellows there. Which of these actually seems to project more, which one is receding, what happens with these colors in terms of the sense of like matte and gloss with the different paint application. Albers never traced in these works, he just used a palette knife. And so you can see when you're looking at Albers, there's a nice, there's a nice Homage to the Square and also a Variance from the 40s here, and you can see just how they're not precise. They seem like these kind of geometric kind of stamps of like design, but they're actually full of variation in terms of the paint application and the way that the masonite panels come through with the like lightness of texture and other things. So to kind of think about what Albers can offer us today, there's a lot of artwork morphologically that might look like Albers, like geometric abstraction, but I think there's this interesting potential to imagine him as a teacher, to teach you how to see the world and to teach you how to paint, for an artist that is coming out of a very different tradition. And this is just a project I did on Sharon Lockhart's work that kind of comes out of the cage history, just to kind of think. There's many, many avenues. You can't wave a dead cat and not hit an artist that doesn't claim John Cage as an influence, It's just, he's so, it's like his teachings at the New School and the experimental composition course he did in 1956 to 58 essentially birthed the Fluxus movement. Like all of those artists were in that class, and the continuing influence of Cage, I think, is beyond the ability of this talk to cover. But just to kind of think, one avenue of that would be Sharon Lockhart's project on Noah Eshkol, who is an Israeli choreographer. She was the daughter of the Prime Minister of Israel, and then began to work in isolation during the war in the late 1960s as her dancers were conscripted to fight, beginning these textiles that she pinned together just on found remnants. She never cut anything, or she just used existing, the sort of chance, constitution of these. And so not that this is this is like exactly like a Black Mountain College thing, but to kind of think this emphasis on the found as the kind of chance remnant, and then these like organization that happens, also the collective nature of this. She had her dancers doing the stitching when they came back, so they would, you know, work with her in the choreography and then sew for her. But, you know, also, not that this is particularly a sort of Merce Cunningham sort of dance, but Noah Eshkol's works are very much based on the metronome. So somewhat like a Cage Cunningham composition or collaboration. And just to remember, John Cage was the musical director of the Cunningham Foundation from when it was founded at Black Mountain College in 1953 until his death. And Robert Rauschenberg was the artistic director of that. So, you know, this is interesting collaboration between, you know, visual form, musical form, and dance. And I think what makes a Cunningham performance so unsettling is the sort of lack of connection between the music and what you're seeing dance-wise, right? I mean, the dancers would learn the pieces without hearing the music. So they had to memorize it based on durations and sort of sequencing of the dance without having those historic sort of cues of dance, like big gesture comes with big music, you know, and so the Noah Eshkol thing in a similar way does not correlate to the sound. The metronome becomes something that's kind of unrelated to the dance happening. But I wanted to shift the gears to kind of quickly talk about this new project I'm working on, the Fuller Effect, that takes up the legacy of Buckminster Fuller and contemporary. What's that? Okay, how much time? So, okay. Do you want a question? Okay, so let me just organize here. If it's 11:30 now, maybe, what's that? Okay, let's do questions about Black Mountain, and then if we have time, we'll do Fuller stuff. So. Oh, thanks.
No,
yeah, we'll take a break.
But
we'll have questions and then we'll figure it out.
If there are questions, please just raise up your hand and we give you the mic. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is this on? Yeah. Thank you very much. It is very rich and full, and I'm looking forward also to hearing more if there's a chance. One thing that I'm missing in this overview, and also in, I think maybe in the exhibition, is the dimension of the literary, Charles Olson's role there, and the presence of the Black Mountain, or the phenomenon of the Black Mountain School, which for experimental writing in the United States is extremely important. I wonder if you can integrate that in any way.
No, I'm just kidding. No, when I first began working on Black Mountain, I did write on Olson, and I was using him really as a kind of fourth figure and a sort of counterpode, I guess, to really think of him as, I guess, encapsulating a lot of the expressionist values that someone like de Kooning may not have been articulate enough to convey in his work as a visual artist. And I was really interested in the way Olson was bringing from Pound the sense of a kind of void of language. That's what Pound's phrase was, and to think about Olson was really interested in pictographs and glyphs and this problem of language that is not based on a visual referent, right? Like a pictograph, is like man is an image of man, and what happens with non-referential language, which is what we use, right? The Roman letters A to Z have nothing to do with the combinations we make of them. So this arbitrariness of the sign in the linguistic form was really fascinating to Olson. But I really found, and having written a little bit on that and being no expert in poetry and not really interested in reading it, though I love Creeley and I do like hearing Olson recite his poetry, it's just not my expertise. And I felt with this project, it was already so overweening to just switch gears and writing, okay, you do the Albert stuff, and then it's like, oh God, I gotta do a composer now, and then switch gears to whatever Fuller's sort of visionary architecture, inventor, sort of personality. And so it really felt like a lot of figures that should or could be, there's so many ways to tell the story of Black Mountain, and I guess that's another story that's sort of waiting to be told well, is what that proto-beat community was doing, and what actually in the teachings of Olson at the college, and what, in these sort of ideas of non-referential language that became so important for, his students, and also sort of them chafing against that. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's not really one that I can answer, but I think it really, and there are, there's some amount of work happening around that. And in fact, I mean, the Vincent Katz project on Black Mountain College that was at the Reina Sofia in 2003, because Vincent Katz is a poet. I mean, he's Alex Katz's son, but he emphasized that a lot more, and it's just not something I just felt like I could do. So. Sorry.
Thanks. Maybe I could just point out that in terms of the reception of Black Mountain in the United States, which you say has been a little bit lacking or less strong than in Europe, I would say that on the literary field it has been very strong, right? Because it is a really fundamental piece in the puzzle of American experimentalism.
Yeah, I mean, it's and I think that story is a little bit more, as you said, it's been told. I don't know if it's been told as well or as definitively, but there's a friend of a friend published a biography of Robert Duncan recently with UC Press that I think has started to kind of unfold just that important hinge period of, what Olson, and Duncan and Freie were doing at the college, and not so much in terms of ideas of influence of students, which has been a lot of the narrative of like, Olson with this dominant personality and this kind of overwhelming imposition, like his kind of, his model of like space and other, things. But I think it's really, because it folded into the San Francisco beat scene so quickly, I think that has always been, when I first started working on Black Mountain, it was always the poets that were known more, in a way, than what was happening there in the 40s in the art stuff.
2 more questions. Yeah.
Thank you for a very comprehensive, wonderful talk. I come from the world of poetry and also philosophy, and I think the question on Olson is apropos in one crucial way, because the 3 experimental models that you follow are all rules-based. And I think that one of the great dangers in the rules-based understanding of Black Mountain is that the place was really not about rules. It was in terms of producing works, but the place itself, as you pointed out beautifully, I'm also from North Carolina, is very isolated. And so the rules structure of the prevailing society was, it's never absent. There was a constant collision, but that freedom, that democratic freedom, was really crucial. And also, as the great-grandson of John Dewey, I have to say that the model of democratic freedom is very, very important to this. And this is something Olson was wrestling with formologically. And also the history, the question of buried history. And this buried history is also missing from this discussion in terms of, let's say, how Albers related to it, let's put it that way. He too was escaping a formal rules-based model, and he applied it. And I think your reference initially to Annie is really great, because I think in some ways Annie's contribution was possibly as great, if not greater, than Joseph's. And I think that's a real problem with the sort of male-based. You're not doing it, but it's very prevalent.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was the kind of problem of writing a project that,
but wait a second,
it's like three
I just
white
want to
guys.
put the emphasis on rules and trying to get outside of the rules-based model of understanding this.
Well, I think that you put your finger on a really important element of what these kind of protocols of experimentation are. I mean, protocol being a kind of, set of conditions that you institute in order to create outcomes that are innovative and unknown. And I think, in terms of history, just to go back to that element of your question, it was a very fraught word for Albers, because particularly the Bauhaus, in the early days of its founding, there was such an anti-traditionalist emphasis. I mean, it was like they were doing creative, new, avant-garde things, and tradition should just be wiped out. Essentially, it was like a sort of ground zero, and I think the founding of the Bauhaus and then its kind of schism around 1923 really underscored that sense of anti-traditionalism. I think that his language around that mellowed quite a bit by the time he came to Black Mountain, and I think he saw, in contrast to the Bauhaus, Black Mountain College as having a liberal arts basis in which faculty were not just art, not just creators really, but scholars too, and I think that was part of this, this sort of shift in his own thinking around those issues. But it was a huge tension at the college, whether they were more of an arts organization or more of a liberal arts organization. So, and I think that in part led to the Albers' departure in 1949, that among other kind of logistical and personality conflicts. But yeah, and I just, to speak to that, yeah, I mean, I think that, oh, I totally lost idea what I was saying. Time for another question. But I think, I think I answered what you were saying in certain part.
Hi, thank you so much for the interesting talk and for showing all this material. I have two practical questions actually. I was wondering how and where the school was advertised so that in a way, students could apply. And at the same time, what were the requirements for the student to apply? What kind of application or like prerequisites were required? Thank you.
It varied according to what period of the college you're talking about, but yeah, the application. I remember talking to the artist, dancer, choreographer Yvonne Rayner a couple years ago, and she was saying, "Yeah, in 1951, I had my application to Black Mountain College all filled out, but I didn't send it in because it was just too weird. I just couldn't go." So even if you think of Yvonne Rayner, who was at that time in 1951 studying with Anna Halprin, like sort of really proto-hippie stuff out in the redwoods of California, that Black Mountain was sort of beyond the pale as an interesting, sort of returning us to just how radical the place was. And it never did have that many people enrolled at one time. I think in the more formal kind of education part of Black Mountain in the 30s and 40s, there may have been something like 30 people enrolled at any one time, so it's very small. And I think they only about 1,000 people ever went through there, and only a couple dozen graduated, because the graduation requirements, it was sort of like not part of what you did there. You'd come and go, and there weren't grades given, and you had an assessment by an outside examiner to complete your studies there. So the application procedure was, I think, a little looser than most schools. You sent in a portfolio, and you had letters of recommendation, and transcripts mattered less than other places. And I think, I don't know, I mean, my sense, and I'm getting a lot of this from Martin Duberman's really excellent book, Black Mountain, An Exploration in Community, which really focuses on the idea of, was it more of an educational institution, was it more of a community? And some of these tensions around who you let in, what is the kind of barrier, how permeable is this place? Because it's obviously not just a community if you have standards of admission, right? But it's not just an educational institution if there's a sense that everybody's working collaboratively together. So his book really uses those questions as the basis, of a very nice study of the college, and it was really the first study. It was published in 1971, and I think answers a lot of those particular questions. But yeah, does that answer?
I can add a few informations to your questions, because I also think there has to be done more detailed research on those issues, because there exist a lot of documents in the archive that can tell you about how they choose the students, and also what's very interesting, how they examined the students. Very funny and broad-ranging questions were asked, and the students should write about interesting topics which would not necessarily be a topic you would think you will be asked when be tested to finalize your college. And this is very interesting material that's not yet written about. And nationally also there are different phases in the course of the college. So there were moments when they were very careful in choosing students, and then there were phases when they were really happy to get applications and maybe even some student fees, because they always had to struggle with the finances, and they offered a lot of stipends, which made it even more costly to run this college. So this has to be looked up more carefully in the future.
One last question, okay.
Could you tell us a little bit about the discourse that happened on these three different forms of experimentations that you found? Was that just happening in retrospect? Because they obviously weren't happening all at the same time. Or was there a platform for the discourse at Black Mountain, or was it just because they lived there together in the community?
Yeah, I mean, my project really kind of coalesces around the period of overlap, which was 1948-49, in which these three models are either established, like the Albers model had been at the college since 1933, and then are being challenged by the Cage sense of this chance protocol, and then Fuller's sense of experimentation as a design revolution, basically. So 1948 is the really the point that they're all sort of in play, and then they go into these different avenues that result in some really interesting and sometimes kind of self-contradictory results or outcomes, in the sense that Albers and Cage have a pretty big falling out around the use of chance in the production of artwork, and though Cage had thought about his work before he started using chance processes is somewhat akin to the Albers sense of experimentation as this marriage of form and order, as Cage said, that when he begins to incorporate chance, Albers couldn't tolerate that as a way to create a work. Albers felt that it abdicated responsibility for what a work looks like, and he wasn't able to see indeterminacy as a potential of innovation. Now, Buckminster Fuller, as Albers was always sort of reluctantly an administrator, and when Albers was the rector of the college for only 1 year, the Alberses left in 1949, and then Fuller was offered the rectorship of Black Mountain and declined it. But I think the Fuller model, interestingly, kind of wraps much more around to Cage, and they became great friends at Black Mountain, and sort of interestingly, by the 60s, it's like two of the most important figures of the counterculture, I guess. I mean, you could add like Timothy Leary in there too, I suppose. But this idea, and I think it comes down to a sort of anarchist libertarianism that both shared, Fuller and Cage, as what they saw as the potential of an experiment is to liberate form from order, societal order. In the case of Fuller, he felt that democratic politics were obsolete, and that the point of the experiment would be to create a technocratic society in which truth would sort of become a mechanism to reproduce society based on this equitable distribution of global resources. And in a way, that was what Cage thought too. I mean, Cage said in the 60s, what Fuller was doing was trying to keep the lights on so an anarchist like me can be an artist. And so I think that there is this, this interesting point that those models of experimentation meet as social models and also as models of the production of forms too, because Cage really sort of appreciated in Fuller. I think even the film on Fuller here that's in the show has a brief clip of Cage, or maybe it's Cunningham saying, what's so great about Bucky Fuller is that he like had failure built into the process of creation, and that's what Cage felt he was doing too, is that in indeterminacy you have this unknown, this huge sort of thing opens up as this potential that you have to, in that risk, accept failure. And so, you know, he and Fuller felt in a way that they were much more risky than someone like Albers, who in this kind of careful testing, you know, comes off somewhat fuddy-duddy or curmudgeonly. And I think it really was a sort of generational shift happening, and it had a lot to do with, in a way, you know, a kind of European model of experimentation being supplanted with these two different but related ways of thinking about experimentation by these American men.
Thank you too. So thank you for your wonderful talk and the great discussion. And I would like to send you now into our coffee break, but please ask you to be on time, because we would like to start like on 12:15 on time with our next talk with Chris Salter.